Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. It's my pleasure to introduce today's programming on behalf of the Human Rights Foundation, the Hoover Institution, and Stanford's GDPi and Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence. First, we will be hosting a panel on the ethics of doing business with China and Chinese companies, moderated by Casey Newton, who until recently was the Verge's Silicon Valley editor. On October 5th, he's launching Platformer, a publication focusing on big tech and democracy. And his recent reporting on TikTok and other Chinese companies and their influence and interactions abroad makes him the ideal person to guide us through today's content. His panelists will be Quartz journalist Mary Hui, whose Asia-based reporting focuses on technology, personal data, and China's influence on business and society in Hong Kong and beyond. Buzzfeed correspondent Megha Rajagopalan, whose reporting was some of the first to help bring the horrors in Xinjiang to light, and has more recently been focusing on facial recognition and social engineering wielded by authoritarian governments around the world. And Alex Stamos, the former CTO of Facebook, who is now working at the Stanford Internet Observatory on the intersection of tech and civil liberties. After the panel discussion, GDPi Director Eileen Donahoe will sit for a wide-ranging fireside chat with former Google CEO and Executive Chairman Eric Schmidt, who famously presided in 2010 after Google's decision to stop censoring search results in China. And as a quick technical note, if you experience any video or audio lag issue, it's probably your connection, and we recommend that you refresh your browser. We also recommend tuning in via Chrome or Firefox for best performance. And with that, I'll hand it to you, Casey. Let's get started. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Jenny. And let's go ahead and bring in our panelists. I believe we have Alex and Mary, at least. Can I see them? Many viewers here, I imagine, may be familiar with the basic relationship between China and the United States when it comes to tech. But just to set some context here, Mary, you're based in Hong Kong. You cover these issues really closely. What demands are placed on non-Chinese technology companies that seek to participate in the Chinese market?
Yeah, thanks, Casey. That's a great question to start off with. And it's an honor to join everyone on the panel today. I guess, yeah, Hong Kong really does make for an interesting case study here as we talk about the rise of digital authoritarianism and the complexities of non-Chinese companies seeking to operate in Hong Kong and the Chinese market at large. And I think especially in Hong Kong right now, where nowhere else in recent history have we seen what was at least a partially free city before come and kind of completely transform into something that's fully under authoritarian rule in such a short period of time. And so in the context of our discussion today, I think Hong Kong's kind of current situation really helps us to crystallize a lot of these issues and questions about the practicalities and the ethics of doing business with China. So I guess a couple of things come up immediately. Of course, tech companies previously looked at Hong Kong as a place where you could trust that an independent judicial system, the existing institutions could provide tech companies with things that are so crucial to them, like data protection, property rights, civil liberties like the freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and the like. And all that has gone out the window overnight, essentially, from when the national security law came into force late in the evening of June 30th of this year. And so, we have, for example, over the course of the past year's protests and continuing into the ramifications of that right now, for example, apps on the Apple App Store running into trouble, whether that's direct censorship or not, what kind of pressure was the Apple App Store put under from the Chinese government? Was it just state media, Chinese state media really ratcheting up the pressure? Were there other things at play? I think we can kind of get into those details with a bit more later on in the discussion. But just to lay the groundwork there, those are some of the complexities now in Hong Kong.
Yeah, and maybe just to underscore that point, for the most part, the big American companies either are not in China, mostly not by their choice, right? Facebook cannot operate there. Google does not operate there. China has sort of intentionally kept those big players mostly out of their country.
Right. And Hong Kong has long been this, I guess, convenient place to establish the operations for the APAC region, the China region.
Right. Well, Megha, welcome. Megha, what are your thoughts on why is this? Why has China taken this really aggressive stance against sort of Western companies bringing their products to market there?
I think there are different answers to that. I think two of the more important ones are about boosting up their own national champions. If you look at the kind of actions taken against foreign companies, the sort of the history of that, it started in areas where there was already a pretty strong national player, like Baidu, for instance, was definitely boosted by Google being blocked in China. And I think in addition to that, there is an issue of government control and government surveillance. So for instance, in China, we all know that the kind of like big and almost only social platform is WeChat, and all of the other kind of offshoots of WeChat that are controlled by Tencent. And the kind of ubiquity of WeChat means that it permeates like every part of your life. Like you need WeChat to even pay a merchant in a lot of places, in cities in China. It's where you find a job, where you might hail a cab, definitely where you communicate with your friends, but also your colleagues, right? So it's not possible to do without it. So in that situation, because WeChat's data and its servers are all based in China, it makes it really easy for the government to get whatever information that it wants about individual users, even if it's in private messages. And that I would just add that goes for kind of different aspects of the government. Like we always think about security services and intelligence and stuff like that. But in reality, lots of different government bodies in China with different kinds of goals and motivations might have the willingness to demand user data from a company like WeChat. And that just wouldn't be possible if China were like most other countries in which Western social media platforms are dominant.
Right. That's very interesting. At the same time, Alex, we see China aggressively exporting its own technology around the world. What are some of the big markets that it's playing in, and why is that so important to them, maybe beyond just wanting to have successful local companies?
Yeah, so what we continue to see is the PRC move their way up the value chain, right? So the start of this was kind of the bottom of the stack of the physical manufacturing of, it used to be low complexity components for physical goods, right? Now, this phone is assembled in the PRC. Something like 2 million Chinese citizens work on the various different supply chains that provide the components to Apple. Those 2 million people are effectively represent a capability that cannot be replicated in almost any other country, right? So the PRC has been very effective at inserting themselves into the manufacturing of really complex consumer goods in a way that's very difficult for us to undo. Now, there's still a couple on the hardware side of components. You still don't have like the highest end semiconductor engineering isn't happening in the PRC yet, but that is an area of intense focus and also an area of intense use of their network intrusion capabilities to take information from South Korean companies. So Samsung's a big target of Chinese intelligence, and especially Taiwanese companies, right? TSMC, the Taiwanese Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, is perhaps one of the most important companies on the planet in that they are the actual manufacturer of a huge amount of really critical hardware that ships around the world. And so they've worked their way up for that. On the software side, what we have finally seen is we have seen the ability for Chinese companies to break into Western markets in the consumer space in a way they've never had before. So, WeChat's big globally, but WeChat's traditionally been big globally because of the Chinese diaspora, right? If you're a Chinese American, if you're a Chinese immigrant, you live in North America, you live in Europe, and you want to talk to your family, WeChat has effectively been the only option. But TikTok is an interesting representation of what I think will be the future, which is that now you have these kind of hybrid U.S.-Chinese companies, often staffed with folks with Chinese employees who've been educated in the U.S., who have worked at American companies, and then are able to go form within the business environment where they're able to do things much cheaper within China, that are now able to directly compete against the American consumer giants, the Amazons, the Googles, the Facebooks, and like. And so that is effectively the top of the value chain, right? If you look at the entire economic value chain here, and other than kind of the highest end semiconductors, the Chinese are now competitive on the entire stack, which I think is really interesting. And then also should be a little frightening for us as Americans, because if we look at what they were able to do for the last 20 years in all of the value chain of hardware, that China made themselves the indispensable nation in a way that I think the United States and other countries are not doing, because we don't have that kind of industrial policy.
Right. And Mary, to what extent is that part of a national security strategy, or what else do you see sort of being in that move that goes beyond, just wanting to sort of grow the GDP?
I think part of it is also kind of this desire to control a lot of the narrative and be able to push out this storyline that is more in line with what the CCP would like the world to see, or would like to have sent out via its own platforms within its own borders to the rest of the world, and have more control over those decisions. And perhaps there are no kind of hard-cut laws or regulations that actually can be designed specifically to get those decisions made. But if the government can kind of put in place the necessary pressure points and levers to get those decisions pushed through, then I think we will kind of see more and more of that playing out in various scenarios where tech companies do have a presence in Hong Kong and China.
Yeah. Megha, does that ring true to you? How much of this is about sort of really projecting influence and a sort of alternate vision of, what tech should look like that is, maybe in pretty stark contrast to a more Western view?
I think there is truth to that. China obviously has its own views on internet governance and what internet governance should mean, both domestically and also, in multinational domains. So part of that is this notion of internet sovereignty, right? Like the idea that a particular country should have the right to control sort of what passes on its internet. And China was arguably the first kind of big player to champion this notion of cyber sovereignty before it was even called that, and to practice it. And I think back in the time when we thought that the internet necessarily led to greater freedom of speech and so forth, nobody would have expected it. But in fact, that kind of model has been adopted by a lot of other countries. And I think that part of that was probably intentional. I think that if China is able to set a norm, that the norm is for a government to decide what is free on the internet and what is censored in the various ways that governments do that, then China benefits from that model, because then people in China are not going to think, oh, I'm actually missing out on something because this is such a kind of heavily censored internet.
Right. Well, recently we've seen a lot of concerns expressed on the subject of TikTok. Alex, you famously did a Venn diagram about your feelings that I think you then sort of upgraded into like more of an Olympic rings configuration with many intersecting opinions and emotions.
It's a Venn peacock now. Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about what was in those rings and how you do think about TikTok in America?
Right. So there are legitimate issues here that we have to deal with. And so that's my first thing. There is a real risk to Western democracies of being on on the overall industrial policy, certainly, but specifically from consumer applications that have a relationship with the PRC state and the Chinese Communist Party that is alien to the way that the legal-based systems that we use for data access in the West. So there is a legitimate issue. Also, TikTok is not my highest concern there, right? And it's pretty clear that TikTok, just because of its being hot and then perhaps the president being pissed at something that happened at one of his rallies, all of a sudden jumped to the top of the list for the White House, not based upon any kind of realistic threat assessment. I think that the way for us, Megha is totally right about the internet governance issue. One of the basic issues we have been fighting about for 20 years, and that we will fight about for the next 10, is who gets to make the rules about the internet, right? Is it governments or not? And if it's governments, which governments? And how do you have multi-stakeholder groups? And how do you weigh human rights issues versus sovereignty issues? Incredibly complex, incredibly hard. Something that the United States should have a very well thought out position on. And instead of us going and saying, this is our position, these are the rules we are creating that we don't mind other countries enforcing against our companies, the White House just kind of went crazy that they had an outcome that they wanted, and then a backwards justification on a national security grounds that was not very well thought out. And that really, in many ways, copied the Chinese model, right? The idea of the executive branch going out and just saying, we don't like this company, we're going to cut them off from the United States, is effectively the start of the Great Firewall of the United States. And it is completely inconsistent with how the United States has talked about internet governance for the last decade. There was a lot of kind of shallow talk of, oh, this is great for Facebook, yada, yada. But the reality is it was bad for all American companies, because this is exactly what the European Union has been trying to do, and exactly what India has been trying to do. That number of economic blocs have been trying to use, both realistically and not so realistically, security concerns as economic policy to either punish American companies or to get them to domesticate their dollar spend and their employee base. And there is a way forward here for democracies to have reasonable concerns and reasonable rules that they enforce, which might end up with some money flowing to those countries. But to go first by something that was clearly effectively the United States trying to steal a Chinese company, and to do so brazenly, demonstrated to the rest of the world like it is open hunting season on American companies. And I think that was a huge mistake. And then the other thing that was in the Venn diagram is I really don't like the way we're talking about TikTok and Chinese tech overall, because it does become pretty racist, right? And like we have to separate out. I try not to use the term Chinese because then you have ethnically Chinese, you have Hong Kong, Taiwan. So we got to talk about the People's Republic of China, the Chinese Communist Party, and we got to be really careful to not take these feelings and to apply them on Chinese Americans, Chinese immigrants, of which a huge amount of Silicon Valley is based upon immigrants who have come here to make a better life, and a big chunk of that is Chinese immigrants. And that whole reaction I find very disturbing.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. As we're sort of moving into what is maybe the end game of the TikTok situation, I saw some comments from the government in China that suggested that this was essentially a win, and that this is how China believes that the internet should be governed with sort of national sovereignty. Mary, Megha, sort of thoughts on whether this whole thing has maybe proved to be a sort of strange victory for China in that sense?
Yeah, I mean, I'll preface this by saying I mostly pretty much agree with what Alex said.
Yeah.
But I think that I've tried to listen to arguments on the other side of the issue as well, obviously. And I think that there are like a couple of the more compelling ones are that it's a lot easier to manipulate like the TikTok algorithm than something like Facebook, where you have a lot going on at Facebook or at Twitter, other than like you'll have like people that you follow. Versus on TikTok, it's sort of largely determined by algorithm, right, rather than conscious choices made by the user. The second thing is that there will never, I'm very sympathetic to this argument that the US should have like a certain set of norms that tech companies should just abide by, right? And that there's no reason why it shouldn't be the same for all tech companies, whether it's a Chinese company or an American company. But then you come to this question of if we did have a situation like that, how would you actually enforce those rules? And I think that it is problematic in a situation where, supposing TikTok were to store all of its data in China, for instance, it would be more difficult than for a company that stores its data in California. So I think it's an interesting question, but to your kind of more direct question about whether it's a win for the Chinese model, I think it's absolutely legitimate to perceive it that way, because this is sort of what they've been advocating. Like, I never thought, I've been covering China for a long time, and I never thought that I'd see the day where the US was wholesale blocking a platform. And, I don't want to equate the two, because the US did not block it for the purpose of censorship, right? Or for the purpose of subpoenaing user data, or they came up with sort of a national security grounds for doing it. But the thing is, the end result looks really, really similar, and I think that that has really surprised me.
So it's a fascinating question to me, and I wonder if you could sort of separate TikTok out of it and sort of separate out maybe the particulars of the case. But if you imagine a sort of random social product, so something that will bring in, media, text posts, images, videos, there's some sort of algorithmic promotion, and that app starts to take off in the United States, and it gets a lot of usage. Alex, you're a security guy. How real do you perceive the risk of that of the Chinese government seeing that as an asset to use for information operations or other purposes?
I mean, it's definitely an issue. So WeChat is the best example here, in that WeChat, there's both evidence of significant surveillance, certainly within the PRC, but there's been good work by Citizen Lab at the University of Toronto demonstrating that they are doing mass surveillance against people outside the PRC, even though they don't obviously censor. There's the censorship and the shaping of the narrative issue, which Megha is totally right that TikTok is actually different than Twitter or Facebook, in that on those sites, you decide, I want to see this content, and then there's algorithmic ranking, where TikTok's all about serving you up content from scratch, right? Which has a very different issue. So there is a legitimate issue here, but I think also there are mechanisms by which we could allow these companies to operate in a way that we have a reasonable set of controls, right? And the model here, and some of the model of what the White House has tried is not crazy, in that the United States does this all the time for defense contractors, right? So like BAE Systems in the UK, or an Israeli company that sells to the US military, they have to create a federal division, and there's a bunch of rules around that and such. And so you can have people working on these systems that are sold to the US government, but there's certain security controls in place. That took years to set up, right? And so if we had reasonable laws around, this is what data that we are okay with having access to others, and this is the data we're not, then companies could realistically spend 6 months to a year of setting up the organization in that way. What it looks like here is that the White House massively overextended, and now they basically have to take a deal because, one, they're losing in court. It's not clear whether IEPA gives the president this power. In fact, IEPA specifically says you can't use CFIUS to affect speech. So that there's going to be months and months, if not years, of litigation here. So they're falling back to maybe a deal in which Oracle is hosting stuff. But the real question is not where is the data physically. In fact, like TikTok's data traditionally was physically in Singapore and the United States. It's who's operating it, right? And that's in all of these situations. When I was the chief security officer, I was not really worried about somebody walking into a Facebook data center and stealing a hard drive, right? Like, I mean, sure, we did security around that. We did red teams around that, but it wasn't a super realistic threat, right? What's much more realistic is that of the thousands of people that have to have some access to user data, that one of them is compromised. And, you're always worried about people being compromised technically, but if people are physically in the PRC, then they don't have a lot of choice, right? And they're not evil, they're not trying to do the wrong thing, but they are in a very difficult situation. And there is a list of situations in which it is clear that stuff has happened in the past. And so, figuring out who has access to what data at what level in reasonable ways to allow software to be built in China, but then the actual operational aspects to be domesticated in the US, I think is a reasonable direction for us to go. But you can't do that in 30 days with an executive order, right? Like, that effectively is, we need a data protection framework in the United States that covers all kinds of privacy aspects, and this would be part of it.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question of what, if we had sort of a sane administration that was maybe appropriately concerned, as opposed to, doing whatever the Trump administration has done, what kinds of regulations could they craft? And maybe someday we'll find out, and I'll try to ask a question about that.
Well, and I think this is Congress, right? The truth is that in a democracy like ours, this is something that Congress should have hearings, and we should have democratic debate about what the standards should be.
Yes. Well, let me shift gears a bit. Megha, you've done tons of really important work highlighting the human rights abuses in China's detention camps for Muslims. And, there's a lot to say about that. But, one of the things I wondered if you could speak about is the threat that tech poses to China's ability to commit these sorts of abuses, whether by social media helping to expose them or other things. And so, maybe could you talk a bit about the extent to which tech, was helpful in the reporting of your story, and maybe about how China thinks about that question?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question, because I think there's a way to illustrate both sides. On the one hand, you have China's shutting out of social media and other kind of like technologies that had brought to light other crises being enormously effective in this case. But on the other hand, you have stuff like Google Earth, which is what we used, being kind of not vulnerable to Chinese censorship. And I'll talk about both sides. So to me, the kind of prototypical example of that is the Syria conflict, where you had a population that had pretty high cell phone use relevant to other conflicts around the world, had access to Western social media platforms, were able to share images and words on Twitter, on Facebook, and it played a huge part in not only bringing attention to that conflict by the public, but also in gathering evidence that could be used in future war crimes tribunal and so forth. So that's why you had so much great open source reporting about it through Bellingcat and other Syrian Archive and other organizations. And I think that, there are people in the open source intelligence community that when they think about documenting the conflicts of the future, that's sort of what they think about. And I think that's one kind of possible vision of the world. But when you look at the Xinjiang case, it's like a desert, because this is a situation where you can get detained just for having WhatsApp on your phone, right? Let alone something like Twitter or Facebook that is really not widely used in China at all. So it's a huge disincentive. You have people, you have police spot checking people's cell phones for banned software, banned apps, and even in airports, people will talk about going through exit immigration. They'll clear everything off of their phone and other electronic devices because they know it's going to be checked, right? So in an environment like this kind of user-generated, content, in terms of videos and photos and stuff like that, is just really not possible. There are cases where footage has been taken out. For instance, the drone video that went viral, I think late last year, which was of a prisoner transfer in Xinjiang. So there are kind of assorted cases like that. But then on the other hand, I think there are still, technologies that we can use to sort of document the situation there. So in the story that we published a few weeks ago, we essentially cross-referenced censored images on Baidu Maps, images we think are censored, with the kind of same locations on Google Earth and other independent satellite imagery providers like Sentinel, Planet Labs, I think a couple others. And by doing that, we basically saw that the censored image is sort of a clue to where the locations of internment camps might be. So we ended up collecting a ton of these censored images. A lot of them were not camps or anything like that, but a lot of them were. And when we kind of looked up those same places on Google Earth and these other services, that we saw what they really were. And it's funny because that's we wouldn't have been able to do it without the censorship, right? That's sort of what's funny about it, because if we had to comb through every little satellite tile in the region, we never would have done it because it would have taken so long. But at the same time, if we didn't have the independent images, especially the ones that were, are free, like Google Earth, that anyone can access, we wouldn't have been able to do it either. So I guess what I'm saying is I think there's still avenues where technology can help us better understand the situation there, but it has a lot more limits, I think, than other parts of the world.
That is fascinating. This is a bit off the beaten path, but I'm just so curious because this subject is amazing, and you've done so much great work on it. As your reporting has come out on this subject and if others have taken a look at it, has it actually has China begun to behave differently with regard to the construction of these camps? Has it sort of doubled down on it, or like what is your sense of what external pressure might have done in this case?
It's interesting because so at the end of 2019, the governor of Xinjiang, who's the second from the top official, he essentially said that everybody who's in the camps is leaving, right? It has left already. So remember, the government says that these camps are vocational training centers. So they said the students had graduated. So obviously this seems, it seems a little nuts, but, you could look at this and say, maybe there's a kernel of truth here. Maybe people are moving out of these camps and into other facilities, right? So like some people thought, oh, they're being moved into forced labor. Other people thought, oh, a lot of people are being processed into the prison system. So when we were doing this project, I sort of expected to find something along those lines. But what we actually found was the opposite. We found that essentially the government in the first couple of years of its campaign had been so sort of desperate to detain lots of Uyghurs and Kazakhs at once, just tens of thousands of people, that they hadn't built enough facilities to actually hold all those people. And this also became clear as like we did the interviewing. And then what ended up happening was like around 2018, they started to build these like massive kind of purpose-built prisons and camps kind of all across the region. So I think that was sort of the primary change that we found. Like the headline on the article was built to last. And I think that kind of sums it up, because I don't think you really build high security facilities like this unless you intend to use them, and probably use them for a significant period of time. So I think that, while all these other things are still present, like, forced labor and kind of other aspects of mass surveillance, other aspects of the repression that happens in the region, I think detention and incarceration definitely continues to play a significant part.
Yeah. Well, so Mary, as American companies consider doing business in China, how should they think about the compromises that will be required? And I'd also be curious to know how they should be thinking about Hong Kong right now, given all of the changes there that you actually sort of wrote about nicely in a story today.
Yeah, I guess I don't know very much about kind of policies that companies are crafting. So I guess I don't have a ton to say about exactly how I think companies, or we think companies, should be crafting their policies as they look to operate in Hong Kong or China. But as to kind of the types of complexities that they can expect to kind of face, for example, even just earlier this summer, the opposition here in Hong Kong organized this primary election, and because it was an unofficial primary, you had these developers come up with their own online voting app that they wanted to get on the Apple App Store. And initially, there was a bit of back and forth, but it was never really approved. And the developers were wondering, well, why is it taking so long? And even leading up to the elections, the unofficial primaries, both the Hong Kong and Chinese governments had been kind of very insistent that these were illegal elections because they were unofficial, they were outside the election cycle. And I guess kind of that amount of political pressure from state actors and official voices was perhaps enough to kind of slow down that approval process. And even after the elections had taken place, so the developers were able to get it onto the Google Play Store, and also just do a web app to get around the delayed approval process on the Apple App Store. After the article that we published on Quartz, kind of explaining this delay, well, Apple then went back to the developer and asked them, was the election official, kind of, I guess, with the intention of trying to get at whether this was an okay election or not. And to this day, to my understanding, the app has not been approved yet. The developers still would like to use it in the future. It wasn't a one-off project, but it seems like going forward, given the kind of the changes that we've seen in Hong Kong since July up till now, I don't think the possibilities of the app being approved are looking very cheerful. And so I guess kind of even that kind of, I guess, illustrates the different decisions that these companies have to make. And I suppose they're looking at state media very closely and various pronouncements from Hong Kong and Beijing governments, just to try and figure out whether they should slow down something, block it altogether, or drag it out and kind of kick the can down the road, so that they don't have to be the one to take the blame for making quote unquote wrong decision in the eyes of the government.
Right. About a year ago, I was talking with a friend who runs a big tech company, and he pointed out that you didn't need a passport to travel until like the 1920s. Like you could just sort of move around. And he said that the internet was essentially like moving into the passport era, right? It's, we call it the splinter net sometimes, right? But like we're sort of rapidly seeing these zones emerge, and living at a time of rising authoritarianism, both here in the United States and around the world, it can be hard to think about what is, if anything, could reverse that kind of ratcheting. Like Alex, when you look at the next 5 years, 10 years, like, do you see anything that breaks this kind of cyber sovereignty mania that is sweeping the globe, or is this just kind of our new reality?
Yeah, the problem right now is that there's no leadership from anybody who wants to stop this path, right? And realistically, the United States is the only country that I think could do this. In that, but we've changed our position on this, and that we're pushing for splinter net now ourselves. And I think it's incredibly sad, and it's incredibly sad. Not just for economic reasons, especially, that's probably the least important, but because there's a huge number of countries that are in the middle right now, right? Who are looking at the American internet of being kind of regulation-free, highly economically successful, but completely chaotic. That look at a European internet that's more and more regulated and yet completely suppresses economic activity. Of the top 20 internet companies by revenue, I think only one of them is European, that's Spotify, right? So it's like Europe has not been able to regulate themselves into competitiveness. In fact, they're going the opposite direction. And then the Chinese internet, which combines social control and regulation with economic opportunity. And so if you're India, if you're Brazil, if you're Indonesia, if you're one of these countries that's either, that's probably a democracy, but a democracy with some authoritarian tendencies and without a lot of constitutional rights for that control regulation of speech, and you're looking at these options right now, you're like, the Chinese option's not that bad. And I think that is China's going to do what China's going to do, right? Like, we need to have a plan around China, but we also have to plan for the 5-something billion people that don't live in the People's Republic, whom their countries are currently on the precipice of going one direction or another. And the truth is the differences between the United States and Europe it's the narcissism of small differences, right? It's these reasonable issues that people have on both sides that can be worked out, because in the end, we don't have a completely fundamentally different view of what the rights of individuals should be online, right? And I would love to see leadership, and it's not going to come from Europe, because part of the problem is in the European side is that there's nobody in a position to do this. This is a very distributed, one of the biggest decisions coming out right now are coming from a court, which you can't really negotiate with a court, and they're wiping out executive treaties that are being signed and such. So it's going to have to come to the United States, where we need a U.S. administration to say, we're willing to regulate our companies. We're going to do so in a way that we're going to give some rights to our democratic neighbors, but we're going to set basic standards that are incompatible with the Chinese vision for internet governance. And so we're going to have to give up. We're going to have to regulate. We're going to have privacy laws. We're going to have laws that restrict the capability of U.S. law enforcement to get certain pieces of data. We're going to have to go much more aggressive than the Cloud Act on that. We're going to need ECPA reform to allow for legitimate law enforcement requests from democracies to be able to be serviced by American companies. We're going to need to do a lot of stuff to regulate in the United States, but we can do so in a way that sets a bar of, yes, we have regulation, but it's within these basic human rights standards, and this is what the free internet is going to look like. We effectively need a NATO for the internet, and nobody, and just like with NATO, the only country that's in position to do that is probably the United States. And unfortunately, we have no leadership in this space. So on the current path, yes, it's splinternet time. And I think that is completely a disaster, not just for our companies and for our economic competitiveness, but for the billions of people whose countries might go in a direction might choose, oh, the Chinese model's not that bad, and can buy the hardware and software to make the Chinese model work straight from Chinese companies.
Yeah, I would more or less agree with that. I think we're looking at a splinternet future. Yeah, I always think about this conversation that I had with, so the leader of Cambodia is a guy called Hun Sen. He's an authoritarian leader. He's been in power for several decades. And he has also a super popular profile on Facebook. And I was in Cambodia working on a story about this a couple years ago, and I happened to meet his Facebook minister. It was like his right-hand man for Facebook. This guy had like 5 or 6 cell phones with which he was operating various Consent accounts. And I asked him about this thing, right? About like, because the Hun Sen government is very close to China, and he had been to China many times and spoken to officials there about the internet. And I was like, well, what do you think about the way the internet is in China? Like, you can't even use Facebook in China. You wouldn't have been able to do this. And he was like, we have to use Facebook now because Facebook is already here and everyone's already on it, and we can't get rid of it now. But honestly, if we could have taken the Chinese path, we would have. And he essentially said we should have, right? So like for a government like that, I mean, I think there are a lot more pluses to, to managing your own like social networks than the other way around. And like a lot of these governments, some understandably and some not, are frustrated by the fact that if they want to get something done, they have to email some person sitting in Dublin or Silicon Valley, rather than going to somebody with whom they have any kind of clout. And I think the bad side to that is, Facebook, I think for all its problems, is not actively trying to, repress the human rights of dissidents or anything like that. Whereas an actor in, certain kinds of countries might certainly be trying to do that, right? So it's weird because it's not like there's any kind of governance function over Facebook that any of these countries or non-governmental groups have, but they still have kind of avenues to publicly pressure Facebook, for instance, to try to hold Facebook to account, for instance, in court, through other ways. I can imagine if there was, like a WeChat entity in countries that are even more repressive, like places like Eritrea, Ethiopia, with very strong information controls, things could actually look a lot worse from a freedom of expression perspective. So yeah, I think there's going to be some kind of negative consequences towards this splinternet future.
Yeah. Mary, it seems to me like you have a really interesting situation because you're living in a place where social media was relatively accessible, and now maybe that is becoming less the case. How have attitudes toward social media changed among people living in Hong Kong during this really turbulent past year or so?
Yeah, so I mean, all the sites that were previously accessible, Facebook, Twitter, Google, YouTube, all of that is still accessible for now on Hong Kong's internet. And of course, after the implementation of the national security law, we had a bunch of tech companies come out and say that they were halting cooperation with Hong Kong authorities for any kind of data requests. But that's kind of a stopgap measure, isn't it? It's not a long-term solution. And so if these companies want to continue to operate out of Hong Kong and within China also, then what's their game plan going forward? And I think for a lot of Hong Kongers, the idea that their data can end up in the hands of mainland Chinese law enforcement agencies, that they can be prosecuted for what they say on online forums, that they can be identified and then have things that they think are anonymous traced back to them, and then have themselves prosecuted under the vaguely defined national security law, where you have crimes like subversion and secession that that can get you in jail for up to life, for something as simple as, for example, waving a flag that incites independence, Hong Kong independence, let's say. So I think what a lot of people here now are doing in the weeks, in the past couple of months, we've seen a lot of Hong Kong protesters getting rid of their Twitter accounts or completely scrubbing their previous histories. people are definitely moving to Signal and other encrypted apps, getting rid of chat histories much more carefully, and then even within kind of the reporting process for myself, we do have to be much more careful because we're operating in this completely different environment. I'm sure, Megha, you're much more kind of familiar with having to deal with those challenges. But for myself, I've only really reported in Hong Kong and the US, and haven't had to deal with those challenges of figuring out how to really make my digital security as watertight as possible. And so the fact that the entire press corps now in Hong Kong has to operate in this new reality means that there is a lot of catching up to do in order to kind of continue doing our reporting while trying our best to not put anyone at risk. So yeah, just kind of a lot of uncertainty ahead.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Some questions have come in. We want to make sure we get to at least a couple. But so maybe while people are also, many of you wrote questions that were like a paragraph long. I would love to see questions that are like a sentence. But maybe while people are typing, Alex, if Trump is somehow dislodged from the presidency, does any of this look very different under a Biden administration based on your conversations you're having?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, our entire campaign is just about Trump and his personal issues, and we've had no intelligent public discussion of our positioning vis-a-vis China. I think clearly things have changed. There have been some moves that have been made by the Trump administration that have been positive in kind of forcing the hand of some Chinese companies and and there is, I think, a much more aggressive feeling towards China in the United States, and that is going to affect the Biden administration. Probably I think what we return to, and you've heard Joe Biden talk about this, is kind of the alliance of democracies model of let's line up countries that don't agree with China. He's a multilateralist at his core, right? And so perhaps a return to TPP of let's come up with an economic alliance that can stand in the Pacific against China. What I would think would happen this time, though, if TPP was resurrected, is now we would directly address a lot of these internet issues that were not addressed in TPP, right? And so you totally could see that being the direction they go. And then I expect on if you look on the TikTok issue, there's a lot of Democrats who are being very hawkish. They're also just trying to be cautious of let's do this right. And so I think you could totally see a coalition of Richard Blumenthal, Mark Warner, of thoughtful Democratic senators who are China hawks, but also understand that the process is important, being the core of this. And then the Biden administration saying, that's a reasonable direction. We're going to go along with it. We're going to follow Congress's lead on a regulatory strategy to deal with Chinese companies.
Right. All right. Well, one of the most upvoted questions that we have here sounds like this, and I haven't decided who I want to call on, and in fact, I may just say anybody who wants this one can have it. So here's the question. In sophisticated chess style, China has created many pins so that it is difficult to challenge it head on. Because of bilateral trade, a Cold War will have dire consequences for the U.S. Because China also has U.S. allies in their pockets, it is very difficult to depend on allies to challenge China's authoritarianism. What systems and areas can we innovate that do not have dependencies on China in order to prevent human rights violations created by China's digital authoritarianism? Any thoughts on that? Somebody can just say AI and quantum computing, and I'll pretend that sounded really smart, and we can move on.
Oh, you said AI and quantum, so here's $2 million in Series A, Casey. You can just give it to you. I would just say, and I think this actually related to one of the other questions, is we have yet to figure out how to motivate Western companies to act within a human rights standard when they operate in China. We have let this go on too long. It would be difficult to undo some of the things that have happened. So, for example, Apple is probably is the most valuable company in the world. They're completely and totally exist because of the forbearance of the Chinese Communist Party, right? And so we've allowed the situation to be created where the most valuable company in the United States is completely dependent on the CCP. And we're gonna have to very carefully start to build incentive structures to force Apple and other companies to start to undo the situations that they have created where they are completely and totally at the mercy, and that some of this leverage is reduced, right? And that will have some, that will reduce the market cap of Apple a little bit, but one of the issues we've had is like the optimization for revenue in China and the cheap supply lines has been great for stock prices, but it's created a massive amount of downside risk, right? And these companies have accrued all trillions of dollars of downside risk that are now in the hands of the PRC. And we have to have a very careful strategic industrial policy around that, and it needs to be human rights based. Apple's also interesting because, I would say at Facebook, the best thing that ever happened to Facebook was being blocked in China, right? Because I do expect if Facebook entered China, a lot of things would have happened that were horrible. Apple's not blocked in China, and as a result, they have gone further than any other American company in helping the PRC with domestic suppression of their people, and we need to start to create either civil or criminal liability for American companies that do that. You can't just do it overnight because, again, we've allowed this to happen, but we're going to have to start to turn up the knob where some of this stuff gets pulled back, and a company, instead of just chasing Chinese revenue, thinks twice about what the risks are in the West. And again, something that has to be done collectively across multiple, it doesn't help us if we stop American companies and then European companies do the same, right? Like this is a coalition of democracies moment where we need to have reasonable regulation here.
It would be amazing if the company that talks the literal most about human rights had to answer for that at all. Did Meg, do you have something to say?
Yeah, I just wanted to add like a small point about digital authoritarianism. So I think that it's really important to distinguish between Chinese digital authoritarianism and Chinese style digital authoritarianism. So in a lot of I'm not sure what the asker of this question, like what framework they had in mind, but I think a lot of times when we talk about this, we're not necessarily talking about China literally exporting tools or exporting technical know-how or whatever. We're talking about a kind of broader issue of other countries emulating the kind of digital tools enabled surveillance environment that China has put in place, right? And sometimes those two things are related and sometimes they're not. You, of course, have a lot of Chinese companies like, SenseTime, Face++, many others that are making surveillance tools and exporting them around the world. But at the same time, you have companies from other places in the world doing this as well. And that includes the United States. It includes a lot of, democracies around the world. And I think that kind of brings it back to this question, which is like, what can we do to sort of decouple ourselves from some of the facets of Chinese authoritarianism. And I think a good place to start is that there should be, standards for companies in the U.S. that make surveillance technology as to whether to sell them to, police and military and authoritarian governments, how to determine how they're eventually used and whether any human rights abuses come from those things. I think when we're talking about moving away from Chinese-style digital authoritarianism, we have to make sure that we're not just enabling the same thing in other countries. Because in that case, like, what does it matter if we're moving away from it if the end result is essentially the same, even if the kind of concept, the philosophy of the system may come from China and other allied countries.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point worth making. Saw some feedback in the Q&A that people didn't like that I expressed a political opinion, which I found hilarious in the context of this discussion. Oh boy,
we're just talking about authoritarianism and geopolitics. Like, how could you get political, Casey?
God forbid you had a thought about what's happening in America or the world right now.
Censor yourself, Casey.
You guys are brilliant, and I've really enjoyed talking to you. And all the rest of the questions are going to take like 5 minutes to answer. So I think we may be running out of time. Does anybody have a final sentence they'd like to add for the folks at home, or something that they want everyone to sort of think about as they leave this session and go into the next one? Then I have done my job, for I have rendered you all speechless. The goal of
I just wanted to give a shout out to Mary and Megha for their work in this area. I think BuzzFeed, like the satellite photo stuff, that's incredible. I love the adoption of these OSINT mechanisms and thoughts within hard news reporting. I think that's awesome. And I think that the physical bravery of people like Mary is really amazing. And I think we all have to think about the folks in Hong Kong whose lives have been completely overturned here, that this is not just like this theoretical thing that we can talk about on these video chats. This is a very real thing for people. So anyway, bravo.
Amen. That is so true. I applaud you both, and we look forward to more of your great work. And with that, I think I'm going to kick it back to, I believe, Jenny to prepare us for the next panel. I'm hoping maybe there's a little smooth jazz we can play as kind of a transition between the sessions.
Yes. So first, let me say thank you, Casey, and everybody for an excellent conversation in the panel before. I want to thank the audience who for joining us and staying with us for this segment. Thank you so much for joining. So I will just start. My name is Eileen Donahoe. I am the Executive Director of Stanford's Global Digital Policy Incubator. And I need to say on behalf of all of the sponsors of this conference, the Hoover Institution, the Human Rights Foundation, Stanford HAI, and Stanford GDPi, we just welcome and thank Eric Schmidt for being here and for taking the time to be part of this program. It is such a great opportunity for us to have a chance to have this ranging conversation with you about technology, competition, national security, governance, and values. I will do this very quickly. Eric is one of those people who needs so little introduction. Here is the short version. He's a technologist, entrepreneur, and philanthropist. He joined Google in 2001, helped grow the company from a Silicon Valley startup, which is hard for us, any of us, to remember, into what it is today, a global leader in technology. And he worked alongside founders Sergey Brin and Larry Page very effectively. He served as Google's chief executive officer and chairman from 2001 to 2011, as well as executive chairman and technical advisor. In 2017, Eric co-founded Schmidt Futures, which is a philanthropic initiative, and he currently serves as chair of the U.S. Department of Defense Innovation Advisory Board. So welcome, Eric. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, so let me say thank you, Eileen. You and I worked together for almost 20 years on these sorts of things. I decided to join, and I brought my pet behind me. So let's go ahead.
Welcome, pet. So I want to start with kind of a level setting. The argument has been made that in the 21st century digital context, economic power, military power, geopolitical power, and even normative power all derive from dominance in digital technology. China's stated goal is to be the world's AI superpower by 2030. Many studies using a variety of different metrics indicate that the US is still dominant in AI, but what is less clear is whether that will be the case for long. So let me begin by asking, what do you think are the right metrics for assessing the relative power in AI? And how likely is it that China will achieve its goal of surpassing the US by 2030?
So we've been looking at this pretty hard, and the general consensus is that the leading research is still done in the US, and that China is in the process of catching up. If I were to give you my personal opinion, I would say we're a year or two ahead of China. We're not a decade ahead. Mm-hmm. And it's important to emphasize this very clearly. The diffusion of the ideas, and in particular the algorithmic ideas and the software ideas, is so rapid now that you can't sort of invent AI at the equivalent of a Manhattan Project and then say, okay, we're going to keep all of these people in Los Alamos. It just doesn't work that way. So you're going to need a strategy to stay ahead that does not involve completely restricting the free flow of ideas. And I think it's pretty clear what that strategy should be, but we're in a contest. And part of the reasons I think that China may win is that they have 5 times as many people. They're very focused on STEM education. They have incentives now in their research community for people to publish papers. This is not, so the quality may not be there, but numerically they're there. And they have a stated central planning goal of dominance by 2030. Another scenario, another question would be asked: if America invents something, should we restrict it? Right. So this sort of classic answer is, okay, let's not give it to them. And the problem with that argument is that if you don't give it to them, they'll just make a copy in the next 1 to 2 years because they'll catch up. The same does not appear to be true in semiconductors. It appears that in software, we can't really bottle it up, but it may be possible to restrict access to certain semiconductor technologies, which I won't go into, which may be more difficult for them to catch up. So if you think of it as a competition, the only way we can win is by doing what we do well and doing more of it. And there's a set of things we have to do, but that's fundamentally where we are competitively.
I mean, one small follow-up is what's the role of data and the scale of data? And how important is that to the quality of the innovation in AI?
So many people believe that China will win because they have no privacy restrictions and they have attempts to put large amounts of data together. They have, for example, a biobank proposal, which is a much, much larger biobank than is currently anticipated in the West for a number of reasons, including privacy. It's not completely clear that that's true because there are plenty of people working on algorithms that require less training data to achieve the same learning. So I would say that the advantage at the moment is for China in terms of its data aggregation. That advantage may be less than people think. It's very clear that brain power algorithmic advantage is profound. In case you're wondering what an example is, as you know, the Trump administration has banned a bunch of software apps and funding and so forth. And TikTok is part of that. And the Chinese government, after one of these bans on a Thursday, on a Friday, announced a ban on the exporting of the TikTok AI algorithm to the United States. To my knowledge, this is the first time that the US government has banned an app inside of the US, and China has returned the favor by banning the export of the algorithm to the United States. It's normally the reverse.
Yeah, it's getting quite interesting there. So I'm going to scare the audience a little bit. Help paint a picture for us. What would it look like? What difference would it make if China does exceed us in AI in terms of national security, economic competitiveness, and also the power to shape the international order?
So the reason people are so profoundly focused on the AI question is that AI is an enabler to everything else. And so let's say you care about material science, or you care about biology, or you care about chemistry, or you care about quantum chromodynamics, or you care about national security surveillance. All of these problem areas, right, have canonical and difficult classical problems that are solved in a different way using AI. I'll give you an example. I funded a fantastic group at Caltech that is doing research on climate change and clouds. And I did not know, but clouds are really important for climate change, and they're extremely difficult to model. There's a set of equations, generally known as the Navier-Stokes equations, which are incomputable at a certain scale with our current technology, right? So what you do is you use AI to approximate the clouds in their algorithms. Mm-hmm. And you sit there to go, oh, no big deal. It's a huge deal because it allows them now to do science that they couldn't before. That narrative is repeated hundreds and hundreds of times. So the reason we're so obsessed about American leadership in AI at the algorithmic level for sure is that those are the enablers for progress in virtually everything else.
Very interesting.
And that I think is missed. The other, we looked pretty carefully at this question. The other one is essentially software platform and semiconductor leadership. Yeah. Because along with the AI algorithms, you need faster processors, bigger data stores, and those sorts of things. And again, there's lots of evidence that China understands this. We are well ahead of China in the semiconductor race at the moment. This has been studied very thoroughly by experts in semiconductors, and there is a huge program inside of China to catch up.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so now I want to turn a little more directly to themes at the heart of the program. So the animating energy behind this whole conference is concern about the global trend toward digital authoritarianism and China's role in it. But by digital authoritarianism and China, we mean three things. One is China's utilization of digital tech for repression at home and role modeling those uses and applications to others. Second is China's export of technologies of repression, as well as the export of digital infrastructure like Huawei 5G, through which they can suck up data and bring it back to China. And the third piece is China's increasing sophistication in international diplomacy, which was written about yesterday in the Wall Street Journal, I think, and shaping global norms in their own image, and especially their growing influence in international tech governance and standard-setting bodies. So first question here, on the export of digital infrastructure. Give us your assessment of the international debate over Huawei. What are the risks to the United States and others of embedding Chinese 5G technology? And where do we stand in terms of a strong Western alternative to Huawei?
So let's talk specifically about 5G. So we collectively screwed up in the race to 5G. China, about 3 years ago, gave 200 megahertz of spectrum to each of the three major telcos in China with a build-out requirement. And China is on its way with mid-band services, which are between 3 and 6 gigahertz, to have pretty ubiquitous 5G. Their goal for this year is 120 million handsets. I don't know about you, Eileen, but I'm waiting for my high-speed 5G service here where I live. And perhaps everyone else in our audience is waiting as well.
Yep.
America led the 4G LTE standards, and we benefited enormously by virtue of the speed increase, the latency decrease, and the other services. The same argument is true for the evolution of 5G. 5G in particular has technologies inside of it which allow for very tight coupling, so-called isochronous operation, which will allow not just IoT, but also real-time IoT where everything's interacting in low latency environments. So ignore whether you want it for the speed, or you want it for the efficiency, or you want it for the latency, or you want it for its increased security, you want 5G. And we are in a position to lose that race. The reason we're doing that is we did not get the right frequencies in the right place. As a technical aside, there is now a discussion in the public about having the DoD, which operates some of those frequencies, to share with preemption for the military, obviously, to using dynamic spectrum sharing some of those frequencies, which I'm involved. And that's a potential solution to this problem. Maybe there are others. Going back to your question about Huawei, Huawei is well known to have, either through error or through malfeasance, set up a situation where information was going to places that you didn't know when you were a user. That's why everyone's so concerned about Huawei. Huawei is the leader in 5G because of the MIMO antennas that they created. And American firms largely left that space. The current leaders are Samsung, Ericsson, Nokia, and a few others. And so we've got a problem where, in addition to not having the industrial base, we don't have the economic structure nor the frequencies to do this. So this is a very serious national security issue for the United States. And you could imagine if we can't solve this problem, China would get a core platform lead that we would be behind, which would be bad. And if we were then forced to use some of their platform, we expose ourselves to certain security risks.
Yeah. So it sounds like you're not too sanguine about the possibility of the United States catching up, and maybe we have to depend more on Europe to lead in this space.
Well, the Europeans have similar problems at a smaller scale. So there's not a good European alternative to this for similar reasons. It requires the frequencies, the money, the operators, and so forth. I think there is a path, which I've been proposing, which involves trying to use this spectrum sharing. It's unclear to me whether that's going to happen or not. If that doesn't happen, then we'll have to come up with some other solution. Every month matters. So every month, while we're sitting here dithering, China is busy building this 5G network. And the reason this is important is not because I want your connection to be faster, which I obviously do, but because it enables a huge generation of new entrepreneurs, new startups, and so forth on top of this 5G platform. I'd like them to be Western-based.
Yeah, so that's a big one. So I want to go to this question about China's influence in tech governance and standard setting bodies. Senator Mark Warner has spoken very eloquently in a recent NDI speech about the link between US leadership in tech and the ability to project our values. And his essential point being that dominance in the technology can translate into the opportunity to embed our values in tech standards and protocols for the next generation of technology. The same is also unfortunately true for China. So my question is, which aspects of Chinese influence in tech governance, standard setting realm are most concerning to you? And in particular, how significant is this China Standards 2035 initiative? Is that getting much traction?
Well, one of the things China does is they announce these broad strategies for their bureaucracy. And you can never tell if that's what they're really doing or they're doing something else. And by the way, we probably do the same thing to them and confuse them. There's a standard body called 5G PPP, I think is the name of it, which has majority Chinese control, which is setting the 5G standards. So whenever you see the Chinese taking a majority role in setting a standards body, that's probably a pretty significant comment on their industrial policy. I want to go back to what Senator Warner said, because that is exactly what I agree, and I agree completely with him. Let's just review Android, ARM technologies which were available to China and are under restriction from the US government and unlikely to be further adopted by China. The fact that the Android operating system is the primary basis for the majority of the mobile phones in China is a net win for America, because it means that the values that were developed in the Android team, which are essentially based on open source and Linux and so forth and so on, are all intrinsic there. Now, the way it works, of course, is China can take that open source platform and they can change it. And indeed, they are doing so. And recently, this week, China announced that they were going to pursue antitrust action against Google, which I found humorous since Google doesn't really operate in terms of search in China. So it's an example of the tit for tat that's going on.
Yeah.
So I'm in favor of a different model, which is a little bit harder to explain, and it's called a rivalry partnership model. And my perspective is I would like America to win. Mm-hmm. And the best way for us to win in these technologies is to have global platforms which are also used by China. And if this is difficult to understand, then understand that that's precisely what China is doing to us with Huawei. Okay. In other words, they're trying to get Huawei to be a uniform standard globally. Yes. And then therefore the values that are intrinsic in the way they operate, which are subtle and important, become part of the way we operate. One of the greatest things about American technology firms and research and so forth is that these products are made with a certain kind of set of biases and values. And I would never want to give those things up. We can debate what they are, but I think intrinsically we know that they involve general openness, general freedom, a general bias toward communication, a general bias against censorship, and so forth.
Great. Okay. So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about Trump administration policies toward China. And also this broader conversation about the so-called great tech decoupling, which you started to get into, and then we'll get more into that. So China has obviously become a gigantic focal point in US political debate. And the Trump administration has sent a clear message that we are being tough on China. This message has obviously tapped into a deep vein of appropriate public concern about China. And in fact, there's been fairly strong bipartisan support for this sort of hardball approach and rhetoric. That said, a lot of people have questions about the efficacy of the specific policies coming out of the Trump administration. And this was touched upon in the panel before. So in recent weeks, there's been a lot of drama about the executive order on TikTok, the potential deal with Oracle and Walmart that was somewhat confusing, the preliminary injunction on Sunday in a US federal district court prohibiting the ban, at least temporarily. Another executive order on WeChat, where my understanding is a lot of US companies lobbied against the executive order for the reason that so many companies, US companies, do rely on WeChat for payment inside China. And then most recently was the Commerce Department announcement last week that put SMIC, the Chinese semiconductor manufacturing company, on the trade blackout list, and basically prohibiting US companies from exporting anything to them without a license. So help us tease out the relative importance of any of these policies. What are the risks from your point of view of TikTok, WeChat, and SMIC?
So let's start, let's parse this out as follows. I think a simple model of what's going on is the White House is using a sledgehammer when it would be better to use a scalpel. And so one way to understand the sledgehammer is that every interaction that is strategic is being shut down. And you want to say to yourself, when you shut down that interaction, what then happens? And in every case, it leads to replication, duplication, or theft of what we're doing and copied in China. You say, no problem, okay? That's okay. It's not okay. And the reason is that when these platforms begin to diverge, which is what you're describing, the divergence, they begin to be different. And once they're different, they cannot be put back together again. So the political agenda, which I understand, which is the sledgehammer and sledgehammer, you could achieve the same objective with a scalpel. So let's go through the specifics. In the case of TikTok, if the concern was data localization, and it's relatively straightforward to require TikTok to keep its data in a US cloud company and then operate the company, but knowing that the data is restricted in terms of the way it's been dealt with. There's all sorts of laws about misuse of data and so forth, and the company would be liable. It appears to me that in the negotiation, that's what they've ended up doing. The reports I've read indicate that the majority company will be owned by the parent, and that the minority will be Walmart and Oracle, who will be providing cloud services. And the cloud services, by the way, current provider is Google. So if you can think of this as a shift of business from Google to Oracle, which is a competitive issue and presumably fine, under pressure from the president. And there's no real change in the status. So in other words, we went through this whole exercise, end up in a reasonable outcome, which we could have just said right at the beginning. So it's the sledgehammer instead of the scalpel. And so now we establish this principle. And so now every European country demands that the United States services, starting with Facebook, be data normalized. And therefore we have to agree to that too, because we demanded it from China. So again, this is the scalpel argument. Now, again, you see the thinking. If you look at semiconductors, and semiconductors are a real issue, the blocking of specific high-value chips to Huawei, which definitely had an impact on their handset business, will cause them to make copies. The blocking, as I mentioned, the blocking of new versions of Android and what are called Google Management Services will now force a domestic Android competitor, which will diverge. So you want to be careful to not screw up the global platforms. And so that's where the scalpel things. You want to be willing and tolerant of local demands of control, but you don't want to break the platform globally, which is what's underway right now.
Well, so right there, let me ask this question. What I'm hearing is that we want them to depend on our chips rather than develop competing alternative standards and their own. So my question about this Commerce Department blacklist, which is basically prohibiting the sale or export to their company that's trying to compete, so that they, in theory, can't compete and they are even more dependent on us. What do you think about that?
I think that logic probably doesn't hold. The result of the blacklist is, of course, they'll become a competitor in their own right, which is not good for the tech companies. I think that the WeChat example that you used is particularly illustrative. It turns out that there was a ban on apps on American mobile phones, which also had the property that it prevented Apple products, which are very popular in China, from being installed with and in their app store in China having these applications, which of course makes those products unsellable in China. So again, scalpel versus sledgehammer.
Yeah. What about? Oh, go ahead.
So the principle I'm trying to articulate is America wins not when the sledgehammer goes and we decouple. America wins when we are the global platform supplier for everyone, including China, which means we know what they're doing. They're using our stuff. It's imbued with our values, all the things the senator talked about. And America wins because that's a much bigger market. It allows us to have a larger audience. Now, in order to do that, and it's important to mention that we have to do some other things, research funding, foreign students, and things like that, which we can talk about. But I'm concerned that we're both decoupling and also harming our global platforms and the things that were the seed corn that made all of us so successful.
Yeah, so the trend is definitely in this direction of this broader decoupling. You're partially saying it's political rhetoric. The sledgehammer is partially just for political purposes. And it's driving us apart in ways that could be harmful to the United States.
Put it another way, I'd like to play chess. And so when you're playing chess, you have to think 2 or 3 moves of your opponent ahead. That's how sort of chess is done, right? We all understand this.
Yeah.
So you have to remember that China has announced that they want to be dominant in a number of industries. And they actually, let me read it to you. In October 1st, they announced their intentions to lead the world in a broad swath of technology, including quantum communications, supercomputing, aerospace, 5G, mobile payments, new energy vehicles, light rail, financial technology, and of course, artificial intelligence. Right? That's like our whole world, right?
Yeah.
So.
But the idea is that we are sort of motivating them through this sledgehammer approach to drive further in that direction.
Yeah, and you could argue against my position by saying they're going to get there anyway, and so why should we help them? And my argument is in these cases, at least for global platforms, we're helping ourselves. Yeah. And I really believe this. And I think that if in fact the world decouples in these platforms, roughly 40% of the communications infrastructure would be under China. We can debate those numbers, but it's on the order of that. So you could imagine a situation where the entire information platforms of the world are divided into 2. A Western one, which has sort of this American bias, and then the China and the BRI countries, which is like about 63 countries. And China is very clever with respect to this because they install these technologies in countries with preferred financing. They undercut their competitors. And of course, with that, they get the surveillance state and the other things that have been discussed in our conference already.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So I have a question here that along those lines that I was going to say for the end, but let's just go right to this. This idea of rebuilding the democratic alliance around digital technology and values. We've watched as the transatlantic alliance in particular has deteriorated over this administration for lots of reasons. And in some ways, we've sort of never quite recovered from even the Snowden revelations. And tidbits like the United States is surveilling Angela Merkel's cell phone. And so European governments, including Germany, have recently turned to this concept of digital sovereignty so that they can get themselves on a path of self-sufficiency with respect to, essential digital technology. In some ways, the European desire to pull back is understandable, and there's, as I said, a lot of blame to go around. But this context concept of digital sovereignty certainly works against what you're talking about, and to me is very much a mistake, not only because it further risks the splintering and fragmentation of the open interoperable internet, the original US vision, which is being deeply challenged, but it also reinforces unintentionally this China concept of internet sovereignty. I will say, in a little different view from you, some members of the international national security community in the United States have sort of said it's time to let go of the open interoperable internet, global everything, because it's already splintering, it's a fait accompli, and some of them are pushing for an alternative. I'm thinking of Richard Clarke, Bob Nacke, even our own Andy Grotto has written about this, that democracies should band together, combine our data and our technology, but let the division happen. And then we have this overarching goal of developing democratic rules for data and tech use applications, and providing a much more coherent, compelling vision for democratic governance of digital society. And the idea being we could attract more countries back to us through that values-driven approach rather than the Chinese, much more coercive authoritarian model. What do you make of that vision? Is that realistic? How do you think about that in terms of your instinct that we can still hold on to this more global approach, having global standards, having the US play a very significant role in those global standards?
A lot of this depends on what you think will happen in a decade. And my guess is the antecedent of your argument is that people believe that we're on for a Cold War and eventually a real conflict with China. Mm-hmm. So if you believe that in 15 years, and that's a legitimate prediction that you can make, then you should clearly do everything that was just suggested and more. Why would you aid your future enemy? I don't agree with that scenario, but what do I know compared to anybody else? I think it's much more nuanced and much more complicated. I think a much more likely scenario is where the two large institutions, I'll call them the West and China, learn to coexist. Now, just to be obnoxious, let me point out that the French and the Germans had to have 2 world wars with enormous losses before they figured out how to coexist next door to each other. So we have history here, and I'd prefer not to go through another world war. And any real conflict with China, knowing what I know about the militaries on both sides, would be so horrendous, it's hard for me to describe. So I'm going to take the position that we're better off not triggering unnecessary conflict with China. And furthermore, that since they've laid out their agenda, which I just read to you, and they are 5 times larger, a form of partnership and alliance strategy, which, by the way, needs to include Japan and Australia and maybe South Korea, is important. So you could imagine the term that's being used is the digital 10. Yeah. There's on the order of 10 countries that collectively could operate this way. And I would argue that this is an opportunity for diplomacy, to try to do the hard work of diplomacy by taking some of the rough edges, getting the ways in which the 10 work together to be a bit more in alignment. And I think that would be a great diplomatic achievement from this administration or a future administration, because it magnifies our impact. Now, the way a foreign policy person talks about this is the following. They say China and the United States are going to set up poles, and then the middle countries are going to be forced to choose. The more we force them to choose, the more we increase the possibility of them making the wrong choice. So I want to be in a situation where the West broadly has a great alternative to Huawei, which can be sold to Pakistan and India, right? Yeah. And these are profoundly important objectives, because once the platforms are established with the values that they have, they're very difficult to change. If you look at Europe, has been relatively slow on these issues for all sorts of public policy reasons. Yeah. And I think it's time for the European leadership and the US to say, we have a common global competitor in the aspirations of China. A competitor is not the same thing as a combatant.
Mm-hmm.
It's a competitor, right?
Yeah.
Where will we partner? Where will we compete? Let me give you an example. Look at the manufacturing of consumer electronics in China. China could easily kneecap Apple by shutting down their factories, but that would destroy so many Chinese jobs that it's untenable. Simultaneously, the United States could gut Chinese manufacturing jobs by mandating that all Apple products sold in the US, and then there would be no way for Apple to get to scale. Right? So there's an example of an uncomfortable relationship.
Yeah.
Right? Not the most valuable company in the world, a great American firm, right, is completely codependent in this sort of semi-adversarial way with China.
Yep.
And you've got to imagine they have one heck of a set of meetings internally in China.
Yeah.
But that's what diplomacy is. That's what rivalry partnership looks like.
Yeah.
And that's the concept that I want to get across here, that the pure decoupling causes everyone to become substandard. I would much rather have China manufacturing Apple's phones.
Yes.
Under U.S. intellectual property design and with American values.
Yes. Yeah, I get that. That does make sense. It's very tricky to get your head around it, though. I mean, the first part of the hard diplomacy that has to happen is between the digital 10 themselves. And, you know, as we were talking about before, there's so many tensions between the United States and Europe right now. You know, Europe has been so focused on US platforms as the most concerning bad actors in the world. They have, you know, sort of forgotten about leading in the technology, and they've lost their ability to actually have leverage where it might matter. And so I think we need to, you know, work on that relationship and these others, but you're basically saying, don't go toward out and out, you know, combat. Think of it in terms of, yes, we band together, but we still find ways to work with China on some things.
It's called a rivalry partnership, and the problem with it is the language sounds weak.
Yeah.
But in fact, it's a strong position. I want the United States to win.
Okay.
I want us to have the best platforms in the world. I want us to do whatever it takes. By the way, just to repeat, that involves allowing the best foreign, including Chinese graduate students, to come to the United States. And by the way, keeping them here as residents and citizens. It involves making sure that we have free trade agreements with our Western partners and keeping tariffs essentially to zero, as low as possible. It means common frameworks on the way platforms work and so forth. And within that, it should be possible to adapt to local rules and local regulations. Yep. I'm also skeptical, having worked on this for a very long time, that Europe will be able to offer a third way. It's appealing to say the Europeans, who are very, very smart, can build platforms that are distinctly different from the American ones and the Chinese ones. I don't think the evidence supports that. The evidence supports that the massive investment in China and the massive competency of China is going to continue. During the pandemic, it is very difficult for me to fly to Europe and for my European friends to fly to the United States. Meanwhile, China is apparently running along just fine, right? That can't be good for our competitive framework.
Yeah. Okay, I have sort of two last questions. One is about the need to actually work with China on other genuine transnational problems that we face.
Sure.
Whether it's climate change or, in theory, pandemics, you know, we should be working together. And maybe say it a little bit more, that seems to work with your vision, that we keep open those lines of cooperation, certainly on shared transnational threats, in your vision of rivalry partnership, rather than going full on, you know, we're not working together on anything.
Well, let's go through the scenario of a Cold War. So then all of a sudden, China decides just to pollute the heck out of the environment because they don't care, and we are the victims of this. I'm not suggesting that they would do that, but that's what happens in a Cold War. Mm-hmm. Imagine what happens in a hot war. So there are plenty of examples of things that we need to collaborate in. One of the more interesting one has to do with no surprises. So what happened in the 60s was people figured out when they played all the various games involving deterrence and nuclear, that one of the most important thing to do was to have a no surprises rule. And so there are all sorts of mechanisms between all the countries, including China, to give people an alert or so forth about what's going on. So imagine a scenario where we don't have that in place and there's some cyber thing going on and it escapes from the lab and we think of it as an attack when in fact it was an error, right? So there's plenty of examples where we know that they're doing stuff there that's dangerous. They think we're doing things that are dangerous. We need to have sort of a, okay, guys, we're not really up to something too bad. It was just a mistake. And until we get through that reasoning, the danger to us of an accident is very high. I don't think we're going to have a war between China and the United States over Huawei or TikTok, but we could easily have one when it appears that the Chinese doctrine, which as best I can tell is to interfere with our communications network, is actually beginning, when in fact it was just a mistake.
Yeah. Okay, so for me, the last question I want to ask is, the panel before us was really about the challenges for U.S. tech companies trying to function in China and be in that market. I want to talk a little bit about the challenges for U.S. tech companies working with the U.S. government and how you think about that. We all know that the big issue for companies in China is the coercive power of the Communist Party in terms of demanding access to data. But again, looking back at the Snowden revelations, we learned a lot about US government also sucking up data from multiple previously undisclosed avenues, particularly from the private sector. And as I said, we've sort of never recovered from that, not only with Europe, but in some ways that really caused a breach between the Silicon Valley and Washington, tech sector and the government. It now seems that the pendulum has swung back and there is a new push for US tech companies to work with the US government. And some, like Brad Smith of Microsoft, has even said there's a patriotic duty to work with the United States. And so I'm wondering, how do you think about that? Where does patriotic duty come into this? And how should US-based but global companies be thinking about their relationship with the US government?
So I remember the Snowden stuff well because I was actually in the White House and actually in the Oval Office with a number of other executives as this was playing out. And I remember one of them giving a speech to the president, which was Obama, come in through the front door, not the back door. In other words, in a democracy, it's not okay for the security folks to be doing stuff that we don't know. Maybe it's legal, maybe it's not. We thought it was illegal. That isn't the point. The point is, it's just not okay. We can't have a collaborative environment. State your intentions, do it up front, do it under the rule of law. That's how America works. And I think that's what the Snowden stuff was all really about, right? At least in the tech sector. And that really poisoned the well. Both Amazon and Microsoft have announced very, very clearly that they will work with democracies, elected democracies for the national security. And Google has now come along to this view after a diversion involving Maven. So I think it's fair to say that that as long as the government is upfront about what they're doing, and they can do this in a secret way with briefings and so forth and so on, the tech industry will work with the US government. To me, the way to say this, the real question is, I don't want the US government to hobble American competitiveness. I want the US government to aid in American competitiveness. So I want to be able to hire as many high skills immigrants as possible, especially those with PhDs in math and physics we need for our AI projects. That seems like a reasonable request. Doesn't seem unreasonable. We've debated this for a year. They're even more important now in our battle for China. So there's a set of things like that. I'll give you another example. R&D funding in America is at roughly 0.7%. It's the lowest number as a percentage since Sputnik. How is that okay? The commission that I lead on AI has argued very strongly and received bipartisan support that these numbers need to increase. For America to be safe and for America to be a leader, we have to have federal funding for research, because that's part of the way the model works. I was federally funded. I'm very grateful to that. I wouldn't be here if that had not occurred. And similarly, we need access to these high skills immigrants.
Great. Well, so we are basically just past the time you committed to. I don't know if you have a minute to take any questions from the audience. Where are you?
We can keep going.
Okay, great. Let's see. This is challenging. Should U.S. export licenses have global impact assessment requirements? I think that means basically human rights impact assessment requirements. And there was an announcement yesterday by the U.S. government about new rules on, exports, especially concerning surveillance technologies that can be used in authoritarian contexts. What do you think about that idea?
I think most Americans would agree that America's values, which start with this lack of surveillance, how to express it another way, should be imbued in both our policies and our products. For the questioner, the cat is out of the bag, or whatever the metaphor you want is. And one thing for you to think about is that our industry operates on open source. Mm-hmm. So all of those incredible gains in vision that were done as part of the image network and so forth were also available to the Chinese. And indeed, our research indicates that in terms of surveillance, the leading companies are now in China. No big surprise for that. I suspect they don't really need our stuff. Maybe the question was about other countries.
Yeah. Well, there is another question here about how does the turn to digital sovereignty affect the future of open source development? And I would add to that is sort of your critique of not just digital sovereignty for one nation, but the national security vision that we have two, China and us. And I'm wondering how you would articulate how that will affect open source as an approach going forward.
I've not yet seen a coherent answer to this, but I'll posit it in the following way. Mm-hmm. A research team at Stanford working with some company invents artificial general intelligence and does so in a way that's really unique and clever. The research team wants to publish this. There's no question that this is a huge strategic issue. What do you do? I'll posit furthermore that if word gets out that this brilliant Stanford team has done it, within a year or two, China will have figured out how to do it as well. Because part of the logic here is that if you can show something is possible, the other side will then figure out they should be working on it as well. And a good example here is the atomic bomb. In 1945, the world discovered we had one. In 1949, I believe, the Russians had something similar. Mm-hmm. So how much of a gain do you get from this sort of very tight control versus running ahead? My bias, which again is I think something open for debate, is I'd rather keep running with everything we have as fast as we can to stay ahead, because I think that the window between first and second is very narrow. And that's why this open source thing is so hard.
Yeah. So somewhat related question. There are several big American companies who have set up, I believe Google and Microsoft, AI R&D projects in China. And I'm curious how you think about, or how those companies should be thinking about how they draw a line between the R&D and the fruit of that R&D when it is potentially usable in technology applications that are repressive by nature. Should they feel that sense of responsibility? Is there, which way should they be going there? Cooperation on the basic science and R&D, or should they not be doing that R&D together because of the potential application? Like facial recognition in Xinjiang, came in part from some collaborations.
Yeah, I'm assuming that we would all agree that in the case of surveillance technology, that's a technology we would not want to export leading technology out, right? Because of its potential for misuse, and in particular, because it violates the values that we hold dear. Similarly, various kinds of censorship technology. It's going to get much worse. I'm sorry to be bad about this, but because of the broad ability to do misinformation, you're going to have, and though that technology is already out there, it's already in open source, it's going to be very difficult to maintain a clean information space and one that's not being manipulated in a democracy or in an authoritarian country.
Yeah. It's getting worse and worse with AI generated text has the potential to take over. We were so worried about deepfakes, just the text is going to be overwhelming. All right, so if you were in a position to set U.S. strategic priorities in AI, R&D, what would you have the U.S. invest in so that we can, take our best shot at remaining a global leader?
So the AI Commission has already issued its first set of recommendations, and I'll just review them with you. A significant increase in basic research. Many of the core aspects of AI, including bias, which people are very worried about, as well as the amount of data, are not fully researched yet. They're not mature yet. There's plenty of reasons to believe that conversation is going to be a huge boon, that the kind of the ability to use GANs to approximate from a small amount of data, a much larger amount of data, has enormous positive implications. I can just give you example after example in AI. And those things are coming out of universities. So I think basically start with more money for basic research. As I've mentioned at least 3 or 4 times here, allow high skills immigrants, and in particular researchers, and particularly from China, to come to the United States and collaborate. They are critical to our research enterprise. Stanford and the HI group has proposed a national research cloud. Yep. We have endorsed that. And the reason is that while a company like Google or Microsoft or Facebook has enough resource for the large computing that is required to do these algorithms, many researchers in smaller places don't have that access. We think that will accelerate a lot of the seed corn. We've also recommended heavy work on the questions of bias and values for the reasons that are obvious. Mm-hmm. And we've also recommended strongly building alliances with the roughly Digital 10.
That's great. All right, so there's the plan. I guess I want to underscore this idea of rivalry partnership and the basic idea that the U.S. needs to not use a sledgehammer, don't go down this path, the Trump path of just bashing and lacking in subtlety, and that the U.S. government should be thinking more strategically about U.S. competitiveness, which will require some level of partnership and access to the Chinese market and cooperation with them.
That's all. The other thing to remember is that our U.S. military and national security infrastructure also needs to adopt AI for the work it does. Many people believe that our national security is heavily dependent upon research and future gains in autonomous systems. And I can tell you, having spent a lot of time on this, that there are enormous gains in intelligence at the national level that would be possible because of the adoption of these technologies. So in addition to doing the recommendations that I described, which sound like they're very pro-citizen, they're also good for our national security. They're good for the government as well.
Yeah.
The majority of our recommendations, by the way, are none of the ones I mentioned. Our real recommendations are talent. When you look at the system of America, there's this weird bifurcation between I'll just call it the tech people, sort of collectively the people who are on this conversation are part of Stanford, part of HAI, and an awful lot of other people who don't really understand it. They're working on other things. And that gap is solved by hiring a whole generation of technically trained young people, pushing them through the promotion systems, getting them to become admirals and generals and so forth over time. And without that, the subtle trade-offs that you're describing will be missed by the people who have to make crucial decisions for our future.
Well, Eric Schmidt, incredibly provocative conversation. You certainly have made me think that I need to go back and reconsider rather than just having my sort of hawkish instincts about China. I will definitely be thinking more about the subtleties required if we really want the United States to continue to lead. So thank you so much.
Thank you to Stanford. Thank you to you. Thank you to everybody involved with us. Thank you to Hoover.
Great. Thank you, Eileen, and thank you, Eric. I also want to say thank you to our panelists from earlier, Casey, Megha, Mary, and Alex. And of course, thank you to everyone tuning in and joining us today. What a great program packed with valuable and lively insight into the nexus of technology and business in China, with huge implications for social media, censorship, and human rights moving forward. Hopefully, this will spark many more conversations and initiatives around these topics. Everyone tuning in, please join us again next week for part 3 of this event series, which will begin this coming Tuesday, October 6th at 12 p.m. Eastern Time, with Hoover Senior Fellow Larry Diamond interviewing Mike Brown, the Director of the Defense Innovation Unit at the U.S. Department of Defense. After Larry and Mike's conversation, we will feature a panel on China as an emerging AI global superpower. And this panel will be moderated by Dominic Ziegler, who is the Economist's Senior Asia Correspondent and founding author of the Banyan column on Asian affairs, who also served as the magazine's China correspondent for 7 years. Panelists include Human Rights Watch Senior China researcher Maya Wang, Carnegie Endowment Senior Fellow Stephen Feldstein, and German Marshall Fund Fellow for Emerging Technology Lindsay Gorman. The conversation will center on how the Chinese government is exporting AI technology around the world. Stay tuned. Thank you, and see you then.